So what's going to happen in the next 4 weeks is that we're going to read your book in kind of close detail and take hopefully smart notes on the book itself. Um, it, it, yeah, as I said, it won't be necessarily an interrogation. I think it's a goal for us to learn how to take smart notes better, and in the process, learn your techniques that you discuss. Um, Perhaps before I start and give it over to questions that we've asked people to generate themselves, I might start with just a general one about the book itself. You released it in 2017, and from there, what's happened? What's your impression of the book and how it's taken course in the wider world?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. That is a really nice occasion to talk about it a little bit. Yeah, it had a slow start, and then I was mostly surprised, pleasantly surprised, how people took it. Not as a step-by-step introduction, but mostly as something that they turned into a very personal thing, and they're very experimental with the system. And I think that's how you should approach it, see how to make it fit for your own needs. And it started as a more like a spin-off from a bigger project I'm still working on, which is more an academic theoretical thing. And um, it's also a bit of a procrastination project, because I was a bit stuck in some ways, and I felt this is a good way of expressing some basic ideas about thinking outside the brain, breaking with the typical representational idea of the outside world and the inner brain. And at the same time, I always had the feeling there is no book I can really recommend my students for note taking, even though it seems to be so crucial for me. And I was always looking for a better way of doing things. And I felt there's a huge disconnect between how we taught learning and how you should approach higher education with your own interest and be open-minded, and at the same time teaching techniques that were really contradicting that on a technical level. So the typical start with your thesis, start with your idea, with your goal, make a plan, and then follow that plan. And that I found really frustrating. So it was really the need to have something I can give my students, which I felt was lacking. And at the same time, I had a huge interest in Niklas Luhmann's work, but mostly the theoretical work. But it always amazed me how it was possible to represent something so complex and at the same time extremely clear and full of clarity, like systems theory, and be able to connect enormously heterogeneous topics in a very systematic way that didn't feel forced. And being very familiar with theories on how technology shapes our thinking, I was really curious about his way of working, and he wrote a little bit about his Zettelkasten, and I was surprised how little attention it got in the academic community. It was mostly dismissed as a funny way of looking at this old professor sitting with all his notes in his study. But obviously there was more to that. And when you compare it to typical text, which are very linear written, they often reduce complexity in a way that is a little bit frustrating. So they take one thing and use it as an explanation for almost everything. And you know, this kind of books that have one idea and they blow it up and try to explain almost everything with this one idea, instead of looking for ways of making connection between very different ideas in a way that is not random. And you need some kind of technology for that, because the brain is, my brain is not able to hold too many ideas at the same time. So it kind of was a spin-off of my theoretical interest, and at the same time something I was generally interested in myself. And I tried a lot of different systems. So I had paper in different formats. I used HTML and I used other apps, but I had this idea, maybe if you put the idea out, someone else is better in programming and figuring out how to turn it into something usable, can take some ideas of that and can come up with a software that works. And somehow, more coincidentally, I think the need for that became clear in other parts of the world at the same time. So Rome, for example, is developed independently, obviously, but it immediately resonated. And I like how ideas sometimes have their time and seem to pop up in different places. And so I have really high hopes about this idea or the technology as being some kind of leverage for changing higher education in some degree, making it more possible to think in an interdisciplinary way and connect ideas and counteract confirmation bias. And yeah, so these are the high hopes, and the small hope is that people benefit from it while they're reading things they found interesting. And I think that's a lot too. Yeah.
Yeah. Just extending that, or focusing in on that before you kind of move to everyone else's questions. So what is the benefit of reading and taking notes in this style relative to just kind of general amorphous, reading and hoping it stays in your brain? What benefit can we expect, or people should be thinking about, in terms of what it allows them to do? I mean, everyone's going to be starting out today with this book. Some may be familiar with it, others may not be. Going through a rigorous process of reading and note-taking, what does it allow that otherwise wouldn't occur?
Well, I think making connections between ideas that are new and old, and some of them we might have already forgotten. And I think if we don't take notes, we are kind of floating on the new ideas, and new ideas are not necessarily better. And the brain is very bad at holding information correctly. So new information, we usually kind of make it fit into our way of thinking. And I'm mostly interested in the moment where you have to make a decision between two notes written at different stages of your own thinking process, and you realize just by looking at them, I thought this is the same idea, but it isn't. In my head, it's pretty much the same. But the moment I write it down and have to make an explicit connection, I have to write on the new note, is it in addition? Is it contradicting? Is it just something else? I have to justify that for myself. And Luhmann speaks of his Zettelkasten as a dialogue partner, and I think that's a very apt metaphor, because it's a dialogue partner who's not very good in thinking for itself, but it's a dialogue partner who is so much better in holding information in the way it was written at that time. And I think that helps with, yeah, problems like confirmation bias or making things fit, and being more humble about our lack of understanding, because at the moment we try to write things down, we often realize, well, it wasn't that well understood, because writing it down is a little bit like trying to explain an idea to others, and it's not the same, but it's the best we have during the day, and when we have exhausted the patience of our partners to listen to what we're saying. So I think that's that are two maybe of the main reasons why it makes sense to take notes, which doesn't mean it makes sense to take note on everything. I think it's one of the filtering processes, because it takes obviously more time than to read more, and sometimes better to read more and not to take notes.
Yeah. So that's a nice way to describe it. And also the idea that is it relevant for, so you come from a perspective of an academic community and for students. A lot of the people in the room today won't necessarily be like that. They'll be from, medicine or from architecture or drama and the arts or programming or different backgrounds more generally. Do you think the advice extends to those types of domains? Is it note-taking a good thinking style as opposed to a good writing style that helps?
Well, 2 years ago, I would be very hesitant to say anything about that, because it was really written for academics and nonfiction writers, so people who professionally write and deal with a lot of information. But since I spoke with a lot of people from different backgrounds, so I used the coaching a little bit to get a better understanding of how other people work and what their needs are, and how the system can be tweaked to different needs. And I'm now much more confident to say, well, I think generally it works for a huge variety of professions. And I think as long as you don't take it as a step-by-step guide, but think about how to make it work for yourself, it can be a good starting point to develop a system. And yeah, so I'm surprised that a lot with a business background are interested in the system. And I think people who program or code have a natural connection to how to store information. But yeah, I'm surprised by the different disciplines and different backgrounds.
Excellent. I'm going to take a few questions from the graph that people have just generated, and one of the ones that keeps coming up is, firstly, obviously Roam is a software tool. Do you think there's anything lost or gained from using software relative to using pen and paper?
I'm not an expert, so there are studies here that tend to, or where it seems that handwriting has some benefits, typing has not. But I think it's not necessarily an either or question. So I often take handwritten notes when I try to clarify something for myself before I write it down in a permanent way. And I think Roam has the huge advantage of removing friction. And I think a typical risk in your software is that you start thinking about the software more than the content you're working with. But my experience with Roam is different. So I'm also very ignorant about new features and all the things you can do, because as long as it doesn't get in the way of my writing and thinking, it has a big advantage to the sometimes a little bit laborious process of going through your paper and looking where it might fit. It has its benefits as well. It certainly has a benefit to not have a screen on at all, because it's constantly, at least to me, a source for distraction. But for me, the net benefit is with software.
Okay, excellent. Good to know. With working for Roam. So I'm going to go to Christina Walter's question here, who says, you called out the biggest misconception of Luhmann's technique of overemphasizing the note-taking and forgetting and omitting the critical aspect of setting a routine. So I think the question is about routines and the process of writing as opposed to the note-taking itself. Can you speak of the routine that you use in terms of note-taking and what it looks like practically?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've developed a routine yet, because Roam, I use it for a couple, 3 months. That's not enough time to really develop a routine. But I think well, my suggestion or my warning would be to look for a perfect system that works every day in the same way. And I think that's sometimes what seems very attractive, that you have your daily routine and it becomes automatic, but it depends so much, at least for me, on where I stand with different projects. So a month ago, I spent 4 weeks just reading, and I took notes, but I took not as many notes as you might expect. I was actually doing the in-between step I kind of advise against within the book, but And that is highlighting things I want to take notes on later, because I felt I need to immerse myself first completely into the books and the topic and understand what it is about and what the main themes are. So that's a luxury, to spend weeks just reading and taking a few notes, but not working on any manuscript or project whatsoever. And then there are times when you have deadlines or you have projects which occupy your mind. And I think it's really important sometimes to focus on just that. And sometimes it's one question that needs all the attention. And that means you spend the days not in a typical routine, but you spend your days talking with people, walking, thinking, doing these things. So, and I think the routine is more something you can fall back onto. So if you feel you're stuck, it doesn't work anymore with what you're doing at the moment, you can go back to the routine and just look for other possible entry points. And being flexible is probably more important than being rigid in a certain way.
Great. I'm just going to take one from the Zoom call, Zoom chat. You've been referred to as a patron saint of Rome. A big inspiration for Connor in the early stages or in the stages of developing Rome. And clearly a lot of people in the community are familiar with your book and work when we think about note-taking. Has that surprised you? Has it changed how you think about your book? Does it mean anything at all in terms of what you work on next in that regard?
I mean, I really like, I got the taste of how good it feels to write something people feel they actually benefit from. So that's, for an academic writer, not something you can take for granted. And I think it does have changed a little bit, because, well, I'm still back to the bigger project, which is more developing a theory and not really being able to talk about the content of it. But I'm pretty sure that I also want to write a book, or to write a version that is more geared to a broader audience. And I was never really interested in the academic community itself, but what it provides to develop ideas that can be actually beneficial. So that's, I mean, people are so generous with their feedback, and they provide very constructive critique and provide ideas. So that's enormously encouraging to think harder about how to write that it can be read by a broader audience than the typical academic community. Yeah.
Okay. Just a few final ones before we let you go. I know I'm not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, so apologies, but I just want to kind of set a frame for what we're trying to do and talk a little bit about that with you, because it's clearly different in some ways, a multiplayer experience, a multiplayer Zetling process, whether that's possible, a big, huge graph with a lot of people in it trying to coordinate that, as well as trying to move through your book collectively in a 4-week process. Perhaps I start there. how should we read your book and how should we take notes on your book? Is there a kind of, how we anticipated it was to, work through stages, to have like a fleeting note stage, as a kind of literature review / settle stage after. Any suggestions there?
I thought about the question, and I think I wondered if maybe it's good to distinguish between or to ask yourself first, what do you want to do with that? Is it something you want to put into practice mainly? Then it might not be necessary to take all the notes on the content and the references. It might not even be necessary to use your own Zettelkasten to build up a critical mass of ideas. But it might be more important to think about how to put it into practice. So the outcome is in that case not another paper you're writing, but something you want to do. But maybe there is also the idea of you're interested in the ideas of the book and to use it as a starting point to develop them further and to go into details and to criticize things or to change content. And that would be more like an intellectual project in itself geared towards your own writing. In that case, I would take much more Zettelkasten notes as described to be able to connect them with new ideas. But I think the difference can be helpful because the best way to put something into practice is not necessarily writing a lot. Sometimes it is, but not necessarily.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And what about, how do you think it changes in Rome? I guess that's something we're going to try and explore and work out, but trying to do it together in Rome. How do you think it changes relative to how you wrote the book? If you wrote the book now with software?
First of all, how to build an individual Zettelkasten within Rome. And the second is what happens if you do it collectively. For the first question, I think there are differences, and I'm kind of glad I kept it a bit abstract with a focus on the principles and ideas behind it, because it makes it probably easier to adjust it to Rome. I think the main difference is that I allow myself to write much longer notes because you're able to have the granularity on the block level. And I mean, others have pointed that out as well. So you can cross-reference between that. Then in the Zettelkasten, one of the main features, which is also something often misunderstood in the beginning, is the note sequences. So notes which are quite densely connected, where you can actually see some kind of dialogue between the notes, where the second note might refer to the one before explicitly by starting like, but in contradiction to that idea, actually XYZ shows this. So there you have these note sequences, which I would now write within one note. And there you can branch out. But when I feel, okay, this is not densely connected, then I would start a new note. I would keep the granularity with one information in each block. And I would also distinguish between different kinds of links between blocks or pages. So my go-to distinction is if I refer or if I tag something with a hashtag, which is just one word, this is usually a link to a page which is more like an index entry where you collect stuff. So you have nodes within your network, and it allows you to jump to a big node and decide where you want to go next. And these are different to links to more descriptive titles. So usually containing more than just one word. And they might be just simple permanent nodes as well, standalone nodes, but they might become like entry points or clusters. And these clusters I would treat differently to these index collection pages, because I would actually describe what it is about on that page. So these are maybe the two main differences to the paper version or to other programs which don't have the block reference feature.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one thing we really want to encourage in the weeks ahead is to block reference. I think as I've organized with you, we've kind of got a large part of the book in the graph now set up, so people can block reference individual pages, blocks, and hopefully there'll be a dialogue on particular blocks at the block level that will emerge, which will be really exciting to see how people start to use that feature. So yeah, really excited to see how that develops, and that feels like a different feature for me relative to what's possible on pen and paper or previously as well.
Yeah, and I forgot. I mean, the difference between individual and collective settling, as you called it, we discussed it before, and I think I can't imagine anything else than having a clear distinction between these two, like a firewall. And I would rather copy and paste content from the collective Zettelkasten into my own, because you get familiar with your own Zettelkasten. And it's like an acquaintance, you get to know better over time and you develop together. And I think that can't happen in a collective process. But at the same time, I'm enormously curious what you come up with experience, what kind of experiences do you have? Because I think there's so much possible when you do something collectively, when you write collectively, that's impossible if you do it on your own. And I'm really, I have no ideas what this will, where that might lead to. So I'm really, really curious about that.
Thanks, Onke. I feel very much the same. I think we all do. I think it's with a sense of experimentation and kind of working at the frontier of non-linear books that we kind of are attempting to do this, and seeing how a big group of people working on the same idea at the same time and writing notes and taking smart notes together, how that can actually change and what emerges from it. So I agree, setting the conventions for this process is incredibly difficult, largely thinking about how people are going to interact. So taking a mindset of a low barrier to entry with some small amount of constraints, and then a high tolerance for variation as we move through, and with the goal to see what happens, really. Really excited to see where we end up as well. And if Book Club 1 was any indication, it's going to be a lot of stuff, a lot of detail, and some cool things that emerge in terms of ideas as well. So, so I know I've mentioned this before to you, but so do you mind if we catch up again and check in and see progress and perhaps even explain how we've been settling in Rome and get some feedback?
Yeah, I would like to know what happened in the meantime and maybe answer some questions or ask some questions myself. So if you want me again, I'm happy to join you.
Absolutely. I'll actually give you access to the graph as well, so you can have a
Great.
look at any time and see what's going on. And we set up a questions for Sonka page, so you know, feel free to jump in and answer any of those. I know I've missed a lot that I've written in there in the discussion today. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us. I know it's late as well, so appreciate your time. Excited to get going, and looking forward to talking to you on the other side of what we're trying to do here. So thank you for flooding in the comments. So a big wave for Sonka as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you again for having me. Bye.
Bye.